Major Jessica Whisper Thompson mastered the art of playing dead years ago during SEAL training, but this was her first time practicing it in zero gravity. Her body drifted listlessly among her 11 squadmates in the transport vessel's cargo hold, her muscles completely relaxed despite the artificial tangle of limbs and gear. Through barely open eyelids, she counted the 6th patrol of Zixathulian guards passing their viewport. Right on schedule. The alien vessel's tractor beam had locked onto their ship exactly 17 minutes ago, precisely when their calculations predicted. The Zixathulians' so-called random patrol patterns had been anything but random. Their species' obsession with mathematical perfection made them embarrassingly predictable. The transport ship's hull groaned as it was drawn into what her intel suggested was the Zixathulian Empire's flagship, the Eternal Dominion. Thompson fought back a smile. They couldn't have picked a better target if they tried. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hull. The distinctive 3-beat gait of Zixathulian warriors. Their exoskeletal legs always made the same rhythmic pattern. Click, thud, scrape, click, thud, scrape. Thompson had memorized it from captured audio recordings, but hearing it in person sent a shiver of anticipation down her spine. Life signs are stable but minimal. A high-pitched voice chirped in surprisingly good English. These specimens appear to have been in cryo-sleep when their vessel malfunctioned. Primitive technology. Another voice responded, this one deeper and more authoritative. Chief Scientist Vakrel will be pleased. We haven't had human subjects for study since the Proxima incident. Thompson remembered that incident well. 3 Zixathulian research vessels had disappeared near Proxima Centauri last year. The aliens still hadn't figured out it was a test run for Ghost Squadron's new infiltration protocols. The cargo bay doors hissed open. Thompson kept her breathing shallow as heavy footsteps approached. Her squadmates remained perfectly still, even Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, whose active unconsciousness was usually about as convincing as a cartoon character's. The extra training had paid off. Examining their equipment, the first voice announced, primitive ballistic weapons, basic armor weave, rudimentary communication devices. Nothing suggesting any significant technological advancement since our last encounter. Thompson felt gloved hands prodding at her tactical vest. Every piece of their gear had been carefully modified to appear outdated. The rudimentary communication device on her wrist contained enough computing power to run a small city. The basic armor weave could stop a plasma bolt at point-blank range. And as for the primitive weapons, well, the Zixathulians would learn about those soon enough. This one appears to be their leader, the deeper voice said, and Thompson felt herself being rolled over. Notice the insignia. Their military hierarchy remains simplistic. She let her head loll to one side, giving her a better view through her eyelashes. The Zixathulian officer stood nearly 8 feet tall, its iridescent exoskeleton gleaming under the cargo bay lights. 4 arms crossed over its armored thorax as it studied her with compound eyes that reflected her own image back like mirrors. Should we separate them for processing? The first voice asked. Thompson finally got a look at its owner, a smaller Zixathulian in what appeared to be medical gear. No need. They're no threat in this condition. Have them transported to holding cell block 7 as a group. Vakrel will want to observe their social dynamics when they wake. Perfect. Cell block 7 was exactly where they needed to be. The Zixathulians had just made their first of many mistakes. As Thompson felt herself being lifted onto a hover stretcher, she did a final mental check of her team's positions. Rodriguez and Anderson to her left, Mitchell and Cooper to her right, Martinez and Sullivan near the back. All exactly where they needed to be for the next phase. The Zixathulians were still chattering about their lucky capture as they transported the unconscious humans deeper into their flagship. Thompson kept counting their steps, mapping their route. In a few hours, these corridors would become a haunted house of human ingenuity, and their captors would learn why Ghost Squadron's motto was "Your technology means nothing." But for now, she played dead, counted steps, and waited. After all, The best haunting always started after dark. Staff Sergeant Mike "Havoc" Rodriguez had been called many things in his life. Marine, fighter, demolitions expert. But clumsy primitive was definitely a new one. He held back a smirk as the Zexthulian guards prodded him toward their processing chamber, his movements deliberately uncoordinated and sluggish. This one's neural activity suggests partial consciousness, the medical officer reported, waving some sort of scanning device near Rodriguez's head. Recommend immediate processing before full awakening. The security chief, a massive Zexthulian with battle-scarred armor, clicked its mandibles in amusement. Look how it stumbles. Hard to believe these creatures ever achieved spaceflight. Rodriguez stumbled again, this time letting his shoulder brush against a guard's exoskeleton. The slight contact told him everything he needed to know about their armor's weak points, just as the briefing had indicated. Gaps at the joint sections, perfect for what he had planned. The processing chamber was a circular room with examination tables arranged like spokes on a wheel. Medical equipment hung from the ceiling on articulated arms, and the walls were lined with what appeared to be containment fields. Rodriguez counted 12 guards, 3 medical officers, and the security chief. Perfect odds. Secure it to the examination table, the security chief ordered. Standard restraint protocol. Rodriguez waited until they had him almost completely strapped down. Then, just as they reached for the final restraint, he accidentally jerked awake. "Wah, where am I?" he slurred, playing up the confusion. "What's happening?" The guards chuckled, the sound like grinding metal. The security chief stepped forward, looming over him. "Remain calm, primitive. You are being processed for." Rodriguez's foot snapped up with precision, catching the chief's lower right arm at exactly the joint he'd identified earlier. The appendage cracked with a satisfying crunch. Before the other guards could react, he had already twisted free of the loose restraints, using the momentum to flip onto his feet. "Situation report," he mumbled, as if still half-conscious. But the words were actually a signal to the tiny transmitter embedded in his molar, alerting the rest of the squad that Phase 2 was beginning. The first guard that rushed him learned about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu the hard way. Rodriguez used the alien's own momentum to throw it into 2 of its companions, their exoskeletons clattering against each other. The second guard got a demonstration of Krav Maga, its primary breathing apparatus crushed by a precisely targeted elbow strike. Containment protocol. The security chief roared, cradling its broken arm. "Subdue the specimen." Rodriguez allowed himself a genuine smile now. "You know," he said, ducking under a swing from a guard's stun baton, "calling someone primitive really isn't the best way to make friends." He caught the next blow with his bare hand, the armor weave in his glove absorbing the shock. "Let me show you some primitive earth techniques." What followed was a masterclass in human combat arts. Rodriguez flowed between styles like water. A Muay Thai elbow strike here, a judo throw there, all adapted for the unique challenges of fighting opponents with 4 arms and enhanced strength. He used the Zexthulians' own height against them, staying inside their reach where their extra limbs became a liability rather than an advantage. The medical officers had retreated to the corners, frantically calling for backup. Rodriguez let them. Each panicked transmission would spread more fear through the ship. When the security chief finally managed to coordinate its remaining guards for a group attack, Rodriguez showed them why he was called Havoc. He triggered the electromagnetic pulse hidden in his dog tags, temporarily scrambling their armor's servomotors. In the 3 seconds it took their systems to reboot, he had disabled 4 more guards. The fight lasted exactly 2 minutes, precisely according to Major Thompson's timeline. As Rodriguez stood among the groaning Zexthulians, he made sure to sway slightly, maintaining the appearance of someone running on pure adrenaline and luck rather than careful planning. "I think," he said to the security chief, who was now backed against the wall, "we need to have a discussion about your guest accommodation policies. The chief's only response was a horrified clicking of its mandibles as it finally realized what the rest of the ship would soon learn. They hadn't captured primitives. They'd invited predators aboard. On cue, the lights flickered, Lieutenant Anderson beginning her phase of the operation. Rodriguez smiled at the chief's growing terror. The haunting was about to begin. Lieutenant Kate Ghost Anderson sat cross-legged in her cell, humming. The sound was barely audible, a low frequency that rode the edge of Zexthulian hearing range. She'd spent months studying their auditory system, learning exactly which frequencies triggered their fight-or-flight response. Right now, she was hitting the one that stimulated their fear glands. The guard outside her cell shifted uncomfortably, mandibles twitching in agitation. "Is something wrong?" she asked innocently, maintaining the precise frequency in her words. The guard's antennae quivered. "Silence, primitive." It snapped, but Anderson noted the slight tremor in its voice. The subliminal tones were working. In the cell across the corridor, Corporal James Wraith Mitchell appeared to be sleeping peacefully. Only Anderson knew he was practicing what the team called ghost walking, a technique that exploited the blind spots in Zexthulian compound eyes. Every time the guard looked away, Mitchell shifted slightly, creating a cumulative effect that would make it impossible to remember exactly how he'd been positioned before. Buckrell's voice echoed down the corridor as the chief scientist approached, accompanied by 2 medical officers. "The brainwave patterns are fascinating," he was saying. "Despite their primitive nature, they show remarkable synchronization during sleep cycles." Anderson suppressed a smile. Those synchronized sleep cycles were actually coordinated planning sessions, conducted through micro-movements and subvocal communications that the Zexthulians' instruments registered as normal human sleep patterns. "The specimen in Cell 4 concerns me," one medical officer said, stopping in front of Anderson's cell. "Its behavior patterns are unsettling." "Explain," Buckrell demanded, all 4 arms clasping behind his back. "It appears to be engaging in some form of meditation, but our instruments detect unusual neural activity." "And the guards report." The officer hesitated, mandibles clicking nervously. "Unusual sensations during its vocal exercises." Anderson switched to a different frequency, one that mimicked the subsonic warnings of Zexthulian apex predators. She watched with satisfaction as Buckrell's exoskeleton bristled involuntarily. "Just primitive human behaviors," Buckrell dismissed, but Anderson caught the slight elevation in his posture. "A Zexthulian tell for uncertainty. Their species often engages in pointless ritualistic activities." A scream echoed from somewhere deeper in the ship, followed by the sound of running feet. Anderson knew it was right on schedule. Rodriguez's earlier escape attempt had just been discovered. The guard's shift change would find him back in his cell, with no explanation of how he'd returned. "Security alert in Section 7. A voice blared over the intercom. "All personnel report." "Wait." There was a pause. "Cancel alert. Prisoner is in containment." "But how?" Buckrell's compound eyes widened slightly. "Report to processing chamber immediately." He barked into his communicator. "I want full biometric scans of all specimens." As the science team hurried away, Anderson began humming again, this time a harmonic that would carry through the ship's ventilation system. In a few hours, the entire security force would be jumping at shadows. Mitchell chose that moment to demonstrate why he was called Wraith. When the guard next looked at his cell, he appeared to be lying on the ceiling. A second look showed him on the floor. The guard blinked its compound eyes rapidly, chittering in distress. "Is everything all right, officer?" Anderson asked sweetly, ensuring her voice hit the fear frequency again. "You seem tense." The guard didn't respond, instead calling for an immediate replacement. As it hurried away, Anderson caught Mitchell's eye and nodded slightly. Phase 3 was proceeding perfectly. Throughout the ship, similar scenes were unfolding. Sergeant Martinez was exploiting the Zixthulian's sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, using her modified dog tags to create ghost readings on their instruments. Captain Sullivan was tapping Morse code on his cell wall, messages that meant nothing but would drive the pattern-obsessed aliens to distraction trying to decode them. In the security center, cameras caught impossible movements, prisoners appearing to be in two places at once, shadows moving against light sources, reflections that showed empty cells where there should be humans. All carefully choreographed, all designed to create exactly the right kind of fear. Vakril would soon discover that his primitive subjects were masters of psychological warfare. By the time Ghost Squadron revealed their true capabilities, the Zixthulian crew would be too rattled to mount an effective defense. Anderson started humming again, a different frequency this time. Down the corridor, something metallic crashed to the floor as a guard jumped at another shadow. Master Sergeant David Cipher Cooper watched the tiny display inside his contact lens count down. 3 minutes until synchronization. His fingers traced invisible patterns on his cell wall, each movement precisely calculated to look like nervous fidgeting, while actually transmitting encrypted messages through the ship's structural vibrations. The specimens appear agitated, a guard reported, watching Cooper's apparent anxiety. "Should we administer sedatives?" The security officer sneered. "Let them panic. It's only natural for primitive minds to." The lights went out. In the perfect darkness that followed, Cooper smiled. The Zixthulians had made the classic mistake of assuming their backup systems were untouchable. They hadn't realized that Technical Sergeant Lisa Spectre Martinez had spent the last 6 hours using the electromagnetic field from their own power conduits to gradually overload their secondary circuits. "Emergency lights." The officer barked. Nothing happened. "Engaging manual override," a guard announced, mandibles clicking nervously. The sound of chitinous fingers against control panels echoed through the detention block. Cooper's countdown reached 0. Across the detention block, 12 cell doors slid open simultaneously. The primitive locks had been child's play for Cooper's nanotools, disguised as simple shirt buttons. The real challenge had been timing the releases to create maximum confusion. Multiple containment breaches. The panic in the guard's voice was music to Cooper's ears. Security teams tow. Martinez struck first. Her fighting style, developed specifically for low-light conditions against Zixthulian opponents, utilized their own bioluminescence against them. Each blow she landed caused their natural defense mechanisms to flare, creating bright flashes that ruined their night vision. The guards' attempts to coordinate were disrupted by sporadic bursts of light from their own fallen comrades. "Specimen location unknown," a guard shouted into their comm system. "Request immediate." The transmission cut off as Captain Sullivan demonstrated why Ghost Squadron specialized in ship infiltration. Every communications frequency the Zixthulians tried was met with either static or, more disturbingly, the sound of human laughter played back at them. Cooper moved through the chaos like a ghost, his movements precisely calculated to exploit the blind spots in Zixthulian compound eyes. Their superior vision, usually an advantage, became a liability as their brains struggled to process multiple conflicting images in the strobing light of their fallen companions. "Behind you," a guard screamed, firing its plasma weapon wildly. The shot passed through empty air, illuminating Cooper for a split second before he vanished again. The Zixthulians didn't realize he was using their own weapon discharge to time his movements, each plasma bolt creating shadows he could slip between. Lieutenant Anderson's psychological warfare paid off as panic spread through the security forces. Guards reported humans appearing and disappearing, impossible movements, and sounds that couldn't exist. Their rigid military discipline began to crack under the assault on their senses. "Fall back to secondary positions," the security officer ordered, trying to regain control. "Defensive formation Delta." "Sir," a terrified voice responded. "We can't form Delta. We can't. We can't see where they all are." Cooper reached the control panel exactly 9 seconds ahead of schedule. His fingers flew across the alien interface, implementing the virus he'd spent hours encoding through those seemingly random wall taps. The Xyxthulians had never considered that their prisoners might understand their computer systems. After all, how could primitives possibly decrypt their advanced technology? The detention block's environmental systems engaged suddenly, releasing a fine mist. The Xyxthulians' exoskeletons began to glow brighter as their natural defense mechanisms reacted to the moisture, effectively turning them into living beacons, while the humans remained invisible in the darkness. Status report. The security officer's voice cracked with fear. "Someone give me a status report." "I'll give you one," Cooper said, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once thanks to Sullivan's control of the comm system. "In the last 30 seconds, Ghost Squadron has taken control of this detention block. Your weapons are disabled, your communications are compromised, and your backup is not coming." He paused for effect, letting the silence build tension. "Would you like to surrender now, or should we continue demonstrating why humans are particularly good at fighting in the dark?" The sound of weapons clattering to the floor was his answer. Phase 4 had ended ahead of schedule. Cooper allowed himself a small grin as he transmitted the success signal to Major Thompson. The Xyxthulians were about to learn that this was just the beginning. Captain Jack Phantom Sullivan held up 3 fingers, counting down silently to Lieutenant Emma Banshee Reynolds. They crouched in the maintenance shaft above the ship's primary communications hub, a space the Xyxthulians had deemed too confined for human physiology. Their overconfidence made Sullivan smile. They'd clearly never met a human contortionist before. "Ready with the sonic package," he whispered. Reynolds patted the modified resonator disguised as a belt buckle and nodded. "Tuned to their exact panic frequency," she mouthed back. "Just like we practiced on their captured scout ship." Below them, 4 Xyxthulian communication officers frantically tried to restore their compromised systems. They hadn't yet realized that every fix they implemented was actually making things worse, thanks to Cooper's virus. Sullivan's fingers reached 0. Reynolds activated the sonic device, broadcasting a frequency that humans couldn't even hear. The effect on the Xyxthulians was immediate and devastating. Their antennae went rigid, their mandibles locked up, and their compound eyes began rapidly shifting focus. All involuntary responses to what their bodies interpreted as an apex predator's hunting call. Security breach in engineering. Sullivan's voice boomed through the speakers, except it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Multiple human contacts. No, wait. They're gone. They're in the medical bay now. How? He cut the transmission mid-sentence, letting their imaginations do the work. Reynolds switched frequencies, this time mimicking the subsonic distress calls of juvenile Xyxthulians. The psychological impact was precisely what they'd hoped for. The officers' protective instincts warred with their military training. Meanwhile, across the ship, Sergeant First Class Tyler Poltergeist Brooks and Corporal Rachel Shade Harrison were putting their extreme environment training to use. They'd accessed the life support systems through an external maintenance port, a route that required traversing sections exposed to hard vacuum. 4 minutes of oxygen left, Harrison reported, her modified flight suit allowing her to move through the zero-pressure environment with practiced ease. More than enough time. Brooks nodded, his fingers dancing across the environmental controls. The Xyxthulians were about to discover why humans were particularly good at adapting to hostile conditions. With a few precise adjustments, he began altering the atmospheric mix in selected ship sections. "Ready with the temperature fluctuations," Harrison confirmed. "Targeting their thermal comfort zones." In the medical bay, Technical Surgeon Brian Spectre Collins was demonstrating why Ghost Squadron's medical training went far beyond first aid. He'd accessed the Xyxthulian biological database, using their own research to identify exactly which combinations of environmental factors would induce disorientation without causing permanent harm. "Medical emergency in Sector 7. Collins broadcasted, his voice carrying the precise pitch of Xyxthulian authority. All personnel report immediately for decontamination. The resulting chaos was mathematical in its precision. As security teams rushed toward the fictional emergency, they ran straight into sections where Brooks had altered the atmosphere. The slight changes in pressure and composition weren't enough to incapacitate them, but combined with the thermal fluctuations and sonic disruptions, it made them question their own senses. Multiple intruder contacts, the security officer shouted into the comm system. They're everywhere and nowhere. How are they doing this? Sullivan allowed himself a grim smile as he and Reynolds moved to their next position. The Zixithulians' rigid military doctrine was becoming their greatest weakness. They couldn't adapt to an enemy that seemed to ignore physical limitations, that moved through solid walls, that could be everywhere at once. Ready for Phase 2? Reynolds asked, preparing another sonic frequency. Sullivan nodded, watching through his tactical display as the rest of the squad reported their positions. Each pair was exactly where they needed to be, their synchronized actions creating a web of confusion and fear that was slowly paralyzing the Zixithulian command structure. Send the signal, he ordered. Let's show them why humans excel at impossible missions. Reynolds activated her transmitter, broadcasting a simple message that would echo through every speaker on the ship, in perfect Zixithulian. Ghost protocol enacted. Nowhere is safe. The haunting was entering its final phase, and the Zixithulians were about to learn that their technological superiority meant nothing against human ingenuity and the art of psychological warfare. Chief Scientist Vuckrell's hands trembled as he accessed his secured terminal, all four arms typing frantically different command sequences. Warning messages flooded his screen. Environmental anomalies, security breaches, communication failures. But it was the file now displaying on his main monitor that made his exoskeleton grow cold. Ghost Squadron, he whispered, reading the classified intelligence report that had just broken through his encryption. No. The document detailed previous encounters with the human unit. Impossible missions. Ships found completely reprogrammed. Entire security forces reporting mass hallucinations. And most disturbing of all, no casualties. They never killed unless absolutely necessary. They didn't need to. A shadow moved in his peripheral vision. Vuckrell spun around, but his office was empty. Searching for something. Major Thompson's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, using his own speakers. Perhaps some insight into your specimens. Vuckrell's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme distress. How are you accessing this system? It's isolated from the ship's network. Is it? Thompson's voice carried an amused tone. Are you sure about that? Are you sure about anything you're seeing right now? The terminal beeped, displaying footage from 6 months ago. A Zixithulian scout ship, drifting powerless near human space. The rescue team had found the crew unharmed but terrified, babbling about shadows that moved wrong and voices in the walls. That was our test run, Thompson explained. Your ship's response patterns were so predictable. Mathematical perfection has its weaknesses, doesn't it? Another file opened, the specifications of their primitive transport vessel. Vuckrell's compound eyes widened as he saw the truth. The damage had been precisely calculated. The trajectory, the power emissions, everything designed to trigger the Zixithulians' instinct to capture and study. The perfect bait, Thompson continued. And you took it exactly as our behavioral analysis predicted you would. Did you really think humans achieved spaceflight with primitive technology? Vuckrell rushed to the door, but it sealed before he reached it. His security override codes did nothing. Interesting thing about Zixithulian computer systems, Thompson's voice mused. They're beautifully designed, elegant, perfect. She paused. Predictable. The lights in Vuckrell's office began to pulse in a pattern that made his vision blur. What do you want? He demanded, trying to maintain his composure. Want? Oh, we've already gotten what we wanted. Your ship's command codes, your tactical databases, your fleet movements. Thompson's laugh echoed through the room. Did you think we were trying to escape? We're not prisoners, Vakrel. We're your scheduled system upgrade. The terminal displayed more footage. Other Zixathulian ships across the sector, all experiencing the same inexplicable malfunctions, all responding exactly as predicted, all executing the same containment protocols that played right into human hands. Impossible, Vakrel whispered. The coordination required, the planning. Humans are very good at impossible things, Thompson replied. Especially when someone calls us primitive. It tends to motivate us. The terminal screen changed again, showing the ship's current status. Systems were falling to human control in a cascade of perfectly timed failures. Each security measure, each failsafe, each backup system had been analyzed, targeted, and compromised. Your empire has been studying humans for years, Thompson continued. But you never really understood us. You saw our different approaches as primitive, our adaptability as chaos, our creativity as weakness. You never asked the important question. Vakrel's scientific curiosity got the better of his fear. What question? Why do humans tell ghost stories? Thompson's voice dropped to a whisper. Because we understand fear. We know its value. We know how to use it. And right now, your entire crew is living one. The lights returned to normal, and Vakrel's door slid open. In the corridor outside, he could hear the sounds of panic spreading through his ship. Phase 6 complete, Thompson announced, but not to him. She was signaling her team. Begin final approach. Vakrel slumped in his chair, finally understanding. They hadn't captured primitive specimens. They'd invited nightmare specialists aboard, and the haunting was about to reach its climax. Major Jessica Whisper Thompson stood in the ship's maintenance tunnel, her team arrayed behind her in strike formation. Above them, the bridge crew of the Eternal Dominion was experiencing what could only be described as a collective breakdown. Multiple human signatures in Sector 3. One officer shouted, "No, Sector 7. They're everywhere." Thompson smiled. Martinez's electromagnetic ghosts were doing their job perfectly. Time to show them why they call us Ghost Squadron. She subvocalized through the quantum comm disguised as a tooth filling. Execute final pattern. Wraith, Cipher, you're up. Mitchell and Cooper moved like liquid shadows through the access panels. The Zixathulians had designed their ship with multiple redundant systems, backup controls, and emergency protocols. What they hadn't counted on was humans who could contort through maintenance spaces their engineers had deemed structurally impossible to traverse. Bridge environmental controls accessed. Cooper's whisper came through the comm. Ready to initiate on your mark. Thompson held up 3 fingers, counting down. Around her, the squad shifted into position with practiced precision. Each member knew their role in what was about to become a textbook example of human tactical superiority. Mark. The bridge's atmospheric pressure dropped by exactly 2.3%. Not enough to trigger emergency protocols, but enough to induce subtle disorientation in Zixathulian physiology. The temperature rose by 1 degree, further disrupting their thermal comfort zone. Something's wrong, the bridge captain announced, mandibles twitching. Run full diagnostic. The lights flickered, and Thompson's voice came through every speaker, every comm unit, every console on the bridge. Captain, she said softly, her tone carrying that specific frequency Anderson had perfected, the one that triggered ancestral fear responses in Zixathulian neural pathways. I believe it's time we discuss the terms of your surrender. We do not surrender to primitives. The captain roared, but Thompson could hear the tremor in his voice. Primitives. She let amusement color her tone. Is that what you still think we are? On cue, every screen on the bridge displayed the same image. Footage of Rodriguez's earlier fight, but from angles that should have been impossible to capture. The guards' movements appeared clumsy, predictable, while Rodriguez's combat style showed clearly planned precision. Impossible, the tactical officer whispered. Our systems are isolated. Are they? Thompson's voice seemed to come from directly behind him. Though she hadn't moved, Sullivan's audio manipulation was flawless. "Are you certain about anything you're seeing right now?" That was the signal. Ghost Squadron burst onto the bridge from 6 different access points simultaneously. The Zizix-Thulian security team didn't stand a chance. Rodriguez and Martinez moved like a synchronized killing machine, their close-quarters combat styles complementing each other perfectly. Anderson and Reynolds deployed sonic weapons that turned the aliens' own communication frequencies against them. Thompson stepped onto the bridge last, her movements unhurried, deliberate. Around her, her team was systematically disarming and restraining the bridge crew with textbook efficiency. "Fascinating thing about Zix-Thulian military doctrine," she said, approaching the captain's command chair. "You rely so heavily on technological superiority that you've forgotten something crucial about combat." The captain's mandibles clattered in barely controlled fear. "And what would that be, human?" "The most dangerous weapon isn't the most advanced." Thompson smiled. "It's the one you don't believe exists." Right on cue, her comm crackled. Similar takeovers were being reported across the fleet. Every captured transport had carried its own Ghost Squadron team. Every ship had fallen for the same bait, executed the same predictable containment protocols. "Your empire made a crucial mistake, Captain," Thompson continued, settling into his command chair as Cooper began accessing the ship's main computer core. "You thought understanding human technology was enough. You never bothered to understand human nature." She gestured to her team, each member now manning a different bridge station with practiced ease. "We're not just soldiers. We're improvisers, adapters. We turn weaknesses into strengths." And most importantly, she leaned forward, her voice dropping to that fear-triggering frequency again. "We're very, very good at becoming what our enemies fear most." The captain looked around his captured bridge, finally understanding. They hadn't just lost their ship. They'd lost their sense of superiority. And that, Thompson knew, was a far more devastating defeat. "Ghost Squadron," she announced into the fleet-wide channel. "Phase 7 complete. Begin final transmission." Staff Sergeant Amy Revenant Parker sat at the fleet communications console, her fingers dancing across the alien interface as if she'd been born to it. Around her, Ghost Squadron had transformed the bridge of the Eternal Dominion into a testament to human adaptability. Each team member manned their station with casual expertise that seemed to unnerve their Zix-Thulian prisoners even more than the takeover itself. "Fleet-wide broadcast ready, Major," Parker announced, suppressing a smile as she caught the captain's mandibles twitching at her perfect command of Zix-Thulian technical systems. Thompson nodded from the command chair, deliberately sipping from a steaming cup of coffee. Another psychological touch that made the aliens deeply uncomfortable. How could these humans be so casual after what they'd just accomplished? "Begin transmission," Thompson ordered. "Let's show the Empire what they've been underestimating." Parker's fingers flew across the console, and every screen across the Zix-Thulian fleet came to life. The transmission began with footage from their takeover, but edited to emphasize the precision, the planning, the absolute control Ghost Squadron had maintained throughout. To the Zix-Thulian Empire, Thompson's voice carried across the fleet, translated perfectly into their language. "We trust we have your attention now." Rodriguez stepped forward, casually disassembling and reassembling a Zix-Thulian plasma rifle as he spoke. "You called our weapons primitive, but we took your ship with them." Anderson moved next, her voice hitting those fear-triggering frequencies with surgical precision. "You thought our tactics were chaotic, but every shadow, every sound, every ghost that haunted your crews was carefully choreographed." "Your systems were perfect," Cooper added from his station, where he was simultaneously managing 12 different ship functions. "Perfectly predictable." The transmission showed split-screen footage from multiple ships across the fleet, each Ghost Squadron team executing their takeovers with identical precision. The Zix-Thulians watched in horror as their supposedly superior forces fell to what they had dismissed as primitive tactics. "But this isn't just a demonstration," Thompson continued, standing now. This is a lesson, a warning, and most importantly, she paused, letting the tension build. An offer. Parker switched the display to show the technical data they'd gathered. The flaws in Zexthulian ship design, the predictable patterns in their security protocols, the weaknesses in their supposedly perfect systems. Humanity doesn't want war, Thompson explained, her tone shifting to diplomatic precision. We don't need it. What we're offering is partnership, a chance to learn from each other. Because while you've been perfecting your technology, we've been perfecting something far more powerful, adaptability. The bridge crew watched in stunned silence as Parker displayed the next sequence. Footage of human achievements throughout history, ancient warriors alongside modern soldiers, cave paintings beside quantum computers, horse-drawn carriages next to starships. Your empire sees perfection as the goal, Thompson continued. We see it as stagnation. You build perfect systems. We break them, reshape them, improve them. You seek to eliminate chaos. We learn to thrive in it. Martinez stepped forward, her combat armor now interfacing smoothly with the ship's systems. You thought capturing us would give you insight into human weakness. Instead, you've witnessed human strength. The final footage showed Ghost Squadron working seamlessly with their captured ship systems, improving them, enhancing their efficiency beyond original specifications. Parker had to admire the psychological impact, showing the Zexthulians that humans could not only match their technology but exceed it. So here's our offer, Thompson concluded, settling back in the command chair. We return your ships, upgraded with human innovations. We share our adaptability, our creativity, our unique perspective. In exchange, the Empire acknowledges Earth as equals, not specimens to be studied. Partners, not primitives. She took another sip of coffee, letting the implications sink in. You have 1 hour to respond. To help you decide. Parker activated the final sequence, a demonstration of Ghost Squadron's improvements to the ship systems, showing efficiency increases that should have been theoretically impossible by Zexthulian standards. Consider this, Thompson smiled. If this is what we can accomplish as your prisoners, imagine what we could do as your allies. The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in profound silence. The Zexthulian captain stared at his former command chair, finally understanding the true message. Humanity didn't need to prove their superiority. They'd chosen to prove their potential instead.